This sermon is from the series Psalms, God's Songbook for All Seasons. It contains sermons preached at Crossway Church over a number of years.
When have you felt stuck? In the fall of 2025, I was finishing up a semester at Calvin Seminary in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And Calvin was done at Thanksgiving, but I was going to transfer to Western Seminary in Portland. Steph and I were dating at the time, and so I was excited to move there. I took off from Northwest Iowa after spending some time with my parents, and the news report was there's a big storm coming. And I was bound and determined to get ahead of it. The whole ride through South Dakota, if you've ever gone through South Dakota, it's pretty wide open. You can see it. There was literally the clouds behind me, and I was trying to stay ahead of it as best I could. It caught up to me in Wyoming, if you know anything about the I-90 route, and there's blizzard conditions, and I had to pull over in Sheridan, and they shut the freeway behind me. But I was bound and determined to go hang out with Steph and to work as a UPS driver to earn some cash. And so I took off as early as I could because I was 4 hours late and behind and I needed to catch up. Well, Wyoming was fine. Their roads were fine. But as soon as I crossed the border into Montana, they were considerably worse. They had not been plowed. Now, of course, I saw the snowplow on the other side of the freeway. And I decided, it might be a smart thing to pull over and wait. Well, I didn't get that opportunity. If you know that stretch, there's some steep roads and had a little bit more momentum than I should on a front-wheel drive Ford Focus station wagon and slid right off the road. It wasn't a big deal. I literally was feet off the side of the road, but there's nothing worse than that feeling of the tires, And then you try and stick it in reverse and put it in forward and see if you can get it. You get out to see if you can find anything, wood, some rocks, anything to give you a little traction just to get you pushed over there. But the snow was too deep, and the problem is the more you try and spin your tires, the deeper you go, and I ended up having to call a tow truck. It didn't help that it was bitter wind and still blizzard conditions, but there's nothing more frustrating, right, than feeling that stuck feeling. But the fact of the matter is that many of us have felt that not only in maybe with a car, but we felt it in life too. Maybe you're stuck in a job that drains us. Maybe you're stuck looking for a job. Maybe you're stuck in a relationship that's broken, or you're stuck with just dealing with financial stress and worries. Maybe you're stuck in sins that you can't seem to shake, and you just feel the weight of that. We push harder and harder and harder, and we try every trick we know, but nothing changes. And the more we struggle in our own strength, the deeper it feels we sink. Well, if you feel that way today, or if you've ever felt that way, you're in good company, because today's Psalm 40, David is going to share about that time when he feels stuck and how God worked in his life. Now, I love Psalm 40. We actually sing it here. It became popular. Well, if you're a U2 fan like I am, it's popular because it's the last track on one of their albums. And we sing a version of that here sometimes. So it may, at least some of these words might seem familiar to you because it is straight out of Scripture. But this is a great psalm, and it's a good reminder that when we're stuck, we are not alone. And it gives us some advice on what we can do. But what I love about David, as I have in all the Psalms, is David is also honest. This one's a little bit different than most Psalms. Most Psalms start with him questioning and wondering where God is and ends with a moment of strength. This one actually begins with thanksgiving for what God has done. Then there's a new crisis, and he ends in a spot asking for help. And I think it's a good reminder that we are always going through ups and downs and challenges, and David mirrors that for us. So Psalm 40, this is the word of the Lord. For the director of music of David, a psalm, I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined and heard my cry. He lifted me up out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and fear the Lord and put their trust in him. Blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, who does not look to the proud, to those who turn aside to false gods. Many, Lord my God, are the wonders you have done, the things you planned for us. None can compare with you where I speak and tell of your deeds. they would be too many to declare. Sacrifice and offering you will not desire, but my ears you have opened. Burnt offerings and sin offerings you did not require. Then I said, here I am, I have come. It is written about me in the scroll. I desire to do your will, my God. Your law is within my heart. I proclaim your saving acts in the great assembly. I do not seal my lips, Lord, as you know. I do not hide your righteousness in my heart. I speak of your faithfulness and your saving help. I do not conceal your love and your faithfulness from the great assembly. Do not withhold your mercy from me, Lord. May your love and faithfulness always protect me. For troubles without number surround me. My sins have overtaken me. I cannot see. They are more than the hairs of my head, and my heart fails within me. Be pleased to save me, Lord. Come quickly, Lord, to help me. May all who want to take my life be put to shame and confusion. May all who desire my ruin be turned back in disgrace. May those who say to me, aha, aha, be appalled at their own shame. May all who seek you rejoice and be glad in you. May those who long for your saving help always say, the Lord is great. But as for me, I am poor and needy. May the Lord think of me. You are my help and my deliverer. You are my God. Do not delay. Now, the title of the psalm, it says it's for the chief musician. There's differing ideas of what that means. It could mean that it's a praise for the song to God, a song written for God, which is the ultimate musicians. But I think most people think that it was probably written to the chief musicians in the tabernacle in David's day or later in the temple, and that this was a song that the people would sing. And what that means is it is a psalm that has some meaning to them, not just in the life of David, but into the life of all of us. And I think there's a good pattern here that David gives for us about what we can do, especially when we are in the midst of feeling those stuck spots, those times when we wonder where God is at work and what he is doing. And David begins very clearly by remembering what God has done. That's how the psalm begins. Now, he describes being in a pit, a place of despair and helplessness with no escape. The language here is literally, he lifted me up out of a slimy pit or cistern. The cistern is something that Joseph was put in Jeremiah. If you're unfamiliar with them, it is a pit where they would store rainwater. And it is usually dry in the summer, but in those in-between months, it would be muddy and mucky. I think we all know about mud and muck right now, don't we? And it was worse than that. And so he says, that's how he describes it. He says that I am in the cistern, and it is mucky and muddy, and it is overtaking me. He was in a place of despair, hopelessness, and no escape. And he wants to make that clear as he declares this. But he is not alone, and he knows that. And so it says that he waited patiently and cried out to God. That's how he begins the psalm, actually. I waited patiently. Now, in the Hebrew, it actually says, in waiting, I waited, which means I waited a really long time. That's what he's trying to communicate. He said, I was in this really rough spot. My life was sinking, it felt like, and I was overcome by the darkness around me, and I didn't know what to do, and so I cried out. I cried out to God, and I waited patiently as I did this. Now, no one's saying that it was easy. It was difficult. You can hear the anguish in David throughout the psalm. But he says, I waited patiently for the Lord, and eventually he turned to me and heard my cry. And he wants to remember the fact that he was in a pit, he was in darkness, even though he had to wait longer than he wanted to, that God was still at work in that. And every time, and even though he cried out many times and wasn't sure if God was really there, that God did hear him and he heard his cry. It's a good reminder for us that faith means trusting him even when answers are delayed, huh? It's easy to have faith in God when everything's going the way that we want it to. It's harder when we're in the midst of that pit and within the midst of the muck. But David says this is when actually crying out to God is most important. And so he cried out to God patiently. He waited and waited and waited, and God eventually heard his cry. When I was doing my research on this story, I found a news article that in March 2022, an Antioch, California man got stuck in a storm drain. It's funny, no one actually said his name because he must have been so embarrassed. 10 news stories on this. No one mentions his name. It's just a man got stuck. For some reason, he climbed in this pit and decided to go down it. Who knows why? But he literally got stuck there for 2 days until finally somebody heard him in the midst of that and heard his cry, and they came to his rescue. Could you imagine 2 days in there wondering if anybody was going to hear you? If you see it, it's not like in the middle of a road where there's anybody there. It's like in the middle of nowhere. It's in the middle of, it looks like a backyard or a field or something. It took 50 people hours to get this man out. And this is what they said. The rescuer said he was beyond exuberant. He was beyond happy to be above the ground. For 2 days, trapped, not in the muck and the mud, but just in a sewer pit, not knowing if anyone's going to hear him, crying out for help. And by a miracle, somebody hears him. And after hours and hours of digging, he's safe. I think that would be his response. Exuberant, probably kissed the ground as soon as he got up there. Now, he survived. We still don't know his name, but it's a good story. And David tells us the exact same thing in the psalm. He says, God lifted me up out of the ground. He said, I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me up out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. Can you imagine how comforting it was for that man who's stuck in that pit to finally be on solid ground? And David says, I was in that spot. I was in a dark space where it felt overwhelming. I waited longer than I wanted to for God to work the way that I wanted him to work. But eventually God worked and he put my feet on the ground, and it is an amazing thing. I want you to think back to your own life of those times when you felt stuck. Those times when you felt like you weren't sure how God was going to work and you didn't even know if you were going to get through it. Write those things down. Because here's the thing. As we go through life, we will go through multiple pits. And when we go into the next pit, we need to do what David did in here. And we need to remember God's faithfulness and how he got us through those difficult times. Because this psalm and our own recollection and our own memory is what God can often use in our own hearts to help us get through the next challenge. And oftentimes it is a muscle that God builds up in us. That the more that we see him work when we're in the dark spot, the less overwhelming the darkness seems. Now, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have a huge impact on our lives. It doesn't mean that it doesn't threaten our peace or our security in him. But the more that we see God work in the past, and we have seen him work when we feel in the spot again, the more quickly we move to trusting him. Now, the truth is we probably oscillate back and forth, right, between peace and trust. But the more we can trust him, the better. And one of the best ways we can do that is to remember those times when it felt like we were stuck in that pit, when we were there and we weren't sure if God was going to work, and he did. I know in my own life, especially in the life of this church, there were many times where I had to remind myself, especially when we were just starting and we weren't sure if we were going to get off the ground, of God's faithfulness and trusting that if God would bring whoever God needs to bring when he needs to bring them. It's easy to say now. It wasn't so easy when your sound guy's gone and you don't know if you're going to have a new one, or a musician, or whoever it may be. But it's good for us to remember those truths. And so this week I want to encourage you, how has God delivered you into the past, and to think about those things, because it's important for us to have them ready to go when we face that pit again. Now, David takes this and he responds with worship and obedience. And in this song, he says it right there, that God gave him a new song. That's in verse 3. He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and fear the Lord and put their trust in him. And that's his goal. He is writing this psalm and he is encouraging the other people of God to sing it in the temple, because he knows that they are going through their own pits, their own difficult times, and he wants to praise God for what he's done. He has this personal testimony, and now he responds with this new song. And in it, he commands us to do really 4 different things. The first thing is to trust God, not in ourselves. He said, "Blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, who does not look to the proud, to those who turn aside to the false gods." When we face the pit and when we face life's challenges, we tend to lean into something. We tend to lean to something that we want to put our hope and trust in. Now, all of us know that the answer should be God and Jesus, but the fact of the matter is sometimes we hold on to other things more tightly. It could be our financial security. It could be our prestige. It could be our relationships. There are so many things that we could lean into. Sometimes it's ourselves, our own willingness to that we can pull ourselves up by the bootstraps and just get through this. Sometimes it's other people. But David said, "Blessed is the one who doesn't trust themselves and doesn't trust others, but rather trusts in the Lord." The question that I want you to think about this week is, what do I turn to when life becomes unstable? It is really those things when life feels unstable. It's the shaking and the earthquake kind of sensation, the tremors of life, that we grasp something, you know? I mean, how many of you have ever kind of, you're falling, maybe you take this step down the stairs and you kind of get disoriented in the dark and you try and grab something. Hopefully you got a rail that you can grab, right, so you don't fall over. But we grab something and a cane, yeah. But some of us, we naturally go to something. And what is that? It's a good question for us to ask ourselves. Is it God, or is it ourselves, or is it others, or is it something? We all go to something, and David implores us to try and trust into God. The second thing he tells us is to remember God's faithfulness. He says, "Many, Lord, my God, are the wonders you have done, the things you planned for us. None can compare with you. Were I able to speak and tell of your deeds, they would be too many to declare." It's like this. David says, "I was in the muck and I was in the mire and I was in all of this difficult situation, and you lifted me up. You took me from the muddiness, the quicksand, and put me to solid ground. And I saw you work, even though I didn't see it later. In the rearview mirror, I saw that you were at work, and I want to declare all the ways that you were at working, and that you were at work, and you are at work in my life, so that when I face that pit again, I will remember your faithfulness." And it's true, isn't it, that gratitude strengthens our trust? When I'm in the midst of those difficult times, what I need to remind myself of God's faithfulness in the past, and that he will be faithful to me again. And that doesn't mean that my life always goes the way that I want it to. It doesn't. But I still know that God has been faithful even when my plans don't happen and his do instead. And so David says to remember his faithfulness, develop a heart of gratitude to strengthen trust. Now, we are coming up to this holiday, I think it's called Thanksgiving, where we can pause and we can do that. And so I want you to think about this question this week. How can I remind myself of the ways that God has come through for me? And maybe just start by creating a list of the ways that God has come through to me. Again, when we're in the pit, we need to remind ourselves of God's faithfulness, and he tells us to do that. The other thing that he says is to offer your heart, not empty rituals. Now, in Psalm 6 through 8, we're going to look at it because there's a New Testament quotation of this. And so David is foreshadowing the work of Jesus. We'll see this at the end. And I think it says here I am, I've come, it is written about me in the scroll is the prophecies of Jesus. But really the heart of it in this matter here is that sacrifice and offerings you did not desire, but my ears you have opened. Burnt offerings and sin offerings you did not require. I desire to do your will, my God. Your law is written within my heart. Now, if you know anything about the Old Testament, that's actually sacrifices and offerings are what God wanted. But what it's hinting at here is that the sacrifices and the offerings themselves were more of a matter of an external thing that showed the inner reality of the heart. The offerings were a way for us to say that God is the most important thing in our lives, and we are going to honor him with gifts. That's some offerings. It's like out of gratitude, they would give the first of their grains. But there was also sin offerings. These things where they would give an animal and they would sacrifice it, and they would be there and have the stench of death. And it was a reminder to them that they were sinners and in need of God's grace. And this whole thing was set up to keep them humble and to help them realize that they needed God. They needed him to take care of their sin problem, and that they needed him to provide everything that they had. And so, yes, they were asked to do those rituals and commanded to do those rituals, but what God wanted was not somebody who just went merely through the ritual and the motions, but to know the heart problem behind it. And he desires us to surrender and give our obedience rather than just religious activity as well. And so he calls us to that. And the last thing that he does is he proclaims God's goodness to others. He says, I proclaim your saving acts in the great assembly. I do not seal my lips. Lord, as you know, I do not hide your righteousness in my heart. I speak of your faithfulness and your saving help. I do not conceal your love and your faithfulness from the great assembly. What it seems like is he's bubbling over. God has worked and he wants to tell everybody about them. And I think we need to do that too. Sometimes we can shy away from having those deep conversations about faith, when the fact of the matter is the more that we can talk about it with others, then we learn either the history of their own faith, but also we can encourage one another. Sometimes when we are in the midst of the pit and in the midst of darkness, just hearing how God worked in the lives of someone, God can use it to give us a moment of peace in the midst of it. Now, we need to be careful that we don't give glib answers and kind of use that to push people away. We want to sit with people in the pit. But at some point, we may also have to give them that encouraging word. As I know it feels like this is never going to end right now, but let me tell you a story of when God was faithful to me. 2 Corinthians 1 says that God comforts us so that we can give comfort to others. And David says, let's proclaim God's goodness to others and so that their testimony can inspire faith in those around us. Now, if the psalm ended there, it'd be great. It would be great because it sounds so awesome, right? God declares my faithfulness. I was in this muck and he raised all this stuff up. And he acted in my life, and that's an amazing thing. And so I'm going to sing this new song about trusting God, and I'm going to talk about how he's been faithful, and I'm going to offer my heart and not go through the rituals, and I'm going to proclaim God's goodness to others, and I'm going to think about those people that I can share this with, and that would be a great ending to the psalm. But we're only halfway through. And there's an about U-turn here that happens actually at verse 11. David is again in a spot where he's in a pit. New trials have come even after past deliverance. He says, my troubles without number surround me. There are an infinite number of troubles. That's not a great number to have. One or two is hard enough, but infinite is even worse. And he says, my life feels that way. Like there's a never-ending amount of troubles around me. And he says even there, he goes, my sin has overtaken me and I cannot see. He acknowledges his sin and his weakness. He says, this thing has got me rattled and it's got me shaken and I'm doing things I know I shouldn't. And these sins have so overburdened me that I can't even feel like I can't see in front of me. We're getting to the fog time, you know? We're getting to that time in our season where you can drive and all of a sudden it'll be clear and then you can hardly see in front of you. And David says, that's how I feel. My sin and this new trial has so overwhelmed me that I can't even find my way in the dark fog. It's that overwhelming to me. But David does what he says he did in the beginning, and he pleads to God for help. And he asks for two things. The first thing he asks for is mercy. Do not hold your mercy for me. Lord, may your love and your faithfulness always protect me. He knows he's overwhelmed by sin. He knows he's overwhelmed by challenges. And the first thing he cries out for is God's help, but he asks him for mercy. He knows that he doesn't deserve it. He knows that he is unworthy of God's love, but he reminds himself and he reminds God of his love and his faithfulness to him. And that word is the loving kindness and the faithfulness of God. And if you know anything about the Old Testament and about our own life, it's this, that God is faithful when we're not. And his kindness and his mercy is always prevalent, even when we push it off and reject it. It's always there for us. And David reminds himself of this truth. And he cries out to God. He says, show me this mercy. But he also asks God to rescue him from his present crisis. Be pleased to save me, Lord. Come quickly. In the early verse, he says, I waited. I waited long, but don't make me wait again, Lord. Come quickly to my help. He says, may all who want to take my life be put to shame and confusion. May all who desire my ruin be turned to disgrace. Whatever challenge he faces, we don't know what it is. David faced so many of them in his own life. But he says, God, save me from this. But he doesn't just end there. He actually ends by urging others to rejoice and to declare God's goodness. He says, may all who seek you rejoice and be glad in you. May those who long for your saving help always say the Lord is great. Maybe David is asking that question because those words are hard for him to say, and he needs other people to say them for him. Maybe it is just he wants to join in that throng because when others start that, it's easier for him to join in. But no matter what it is, he urges believers to rejoice and to declare God's goodness. And when we are in the midst of the pit, we can be honest to God, we can ask him for his help, but it's also good for us to remind ourselves that God is faithful and he is good, even when it doesn't feel like it. And that he is at work in our lives, guiding and directing us, even when we don't feel like there's any clarity, when the fog or the pit overtake us. It reminds us that worship is possible even in waiting. You know, sometimes I think that we sit in these spots where we think it's one or the other, right? No, life is more of a mix and a mix smash. When we're in the pit, there are times where we can cry out to God in patience, and there are times when we say, God, come quickly because this is too hard. There are times where we can be assured that God's going to be faithful and he's going to be good. And there are times where it just feels like everything is overwhelming and we don't know if we're even going to get through it because all the challenges just seem so much. And David communicates both of these things so beautifully in this psalm. But he ends in a kind of unique way. He ends not declaring the goodness of God. Well, he does. But he does something before that. He admits his neediness, and he looks alone to God to save him. But as for me, I am poor and needy. Poor and needy. That's how he describes himself. He admits that he is helpless, and he needs God to save him. And so he admits his own neediness. I don't like to think myself of poor and needy. I like to think of myself as self-sufficient. But when I'm in the pits of life, when I'm feeling stuck, I can't push my own car out, I need help. And when we're in those pits, that's the first place for us to begin with. Lord, I'm poor and I'm needy and I need your help. And he asks God to think of him, For some of us, we have this view of God that he's so big and so distant that why would he even care about poor little me? That's not David's perspective. David's perspective is actually, I can cry out to God and God will think about me because God is faithful and he is kind and he will show his mercy to me. Do you see what he says? May the Lord think of me because you are my help and you are my deliverer. You are my God. Do not delay. And for some of us here, the challenge that we need to think is we need to realize that God thinks of us. And we don't need to not bring our request to him because, well, he's got bigger things to think about. No, he can handle all of that stuff. He's the infinite, almighty, powerful God who's present in everything. And he wants to be present in your life. And he thinks about you. And he is there to help us. And he is there to be our God. And so we do not need to be afraid of bringing our requests to him because he is already aware of them. But there's something powerful about admitting our neediness and asking God to think about us and to act in that. I think sometimes when we fail to ask, we fail to see God at work, you know? I mean, because we think we just did it on our own, when the fact of the matter is when I ask God and all of a sudden there's an answered prayer, it's like, well, I guess I didn't do that on my own. He answered that prayer. That's the neediness there. And it's actually a way for us to get to know God and to see him at work more in our lives so that we can declare those things. But there's something I love about this psalm. The song that we sing, it says, I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined and heard my cry. He lifted me up out of the pit, out of the mire and clay. I will sing a new song. And then it says, I'll sing. And then it ends with how long? David sang these words for a long time. But in that opening thing of Hebrews 6 through 8, in Psalm 8, verses 6 through 8, we know that his prayer is answered. Because in Hebrews, it tells us that God answered his request for deliverance. It's interesting that the author of Hebrews is in this spot where he talks about how Christ is greater than the Old Testament, how he fulfilled all of the Old Testament, and one of the things that he fulfilled was the sacrifices and offerings, and he quotes this psalm. And he basically uses it to say this: sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings you did not desire, nor were you pleased with, though they were offered in accordance to the law. But then he said, here I am, and I have come to do your will. He sets aside the first to establish the second, and by that will we have been made holy through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ once and for all. And so what he's saying here is this, that when God said through the words of David that he wants something more than just the sacrifices and the offerings, but he wants our hearts, that the ultimate fulfillment of that is going to be in Jesus himself. In Jesus himself. David's hope points forward to Jesus, the one who perfectly obeyed God's will and sacrificed himself so that we don't have to go through those rituals. Rather, our relationship with God is restored because he paid the price for our sins. We become needy and we become aware of our own sins. And it feels overwhelming to us because we know that it separates us from God. But Hebrews says that we don't have to fear because Psalm 40 was fulfilled in Jesus. He perfectly obeyed God's will and he willingly gave up his life so that we can come to have a relationship with him through his sacrifice once and for all. And scripture is clear that Christ lifts up from the pit of sin and sets us on the rock of salvation. One of my favorite verses in all the Bible is a simple one. It says this: for he has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, in whom we have redemption and the forgiveness of sins. When we put our hope and trust in Jesus, when God reveals himself to us and we admit our brokenness as David did, and we cry out to God for help, asking him to show us mercy and asking him to work in our lives, he does this major thing. He moves us from a kingdom of darkness and sin and into the kingdom of the Son, and we are there for all eternity. And our feet are now secure, and they sit and rest in a powerful thing. And so we can say too, I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined and heard my cry. He lifted me up out of the pit of my sin and set me on the firm ground at the foot of the cross. And so in Jesus, we can find mercy and deliverance and the new song that never fades. Now, this song that Paul gives us in Ephesians is not a psalm, it's a prayer, but it easily could be. He says, praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us in the heavenly realms with every spiritual blessing in Christ. For he chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless and in sight. In his love, he predestined us for adoption to sonship through Jesus Christ in accordance with his pleasure and will. Did you hear that? God brought us to him because he thinks about us, but not just thinks about us. He thinks about us in a good way because he draws us to faith in him and to the praise of his glorious grace, which he has freely given to us in the one he loves. In him, in Jesus, we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins in accordance with his rich grace that he has lavished on us with all wisdom and understanding. Doesn't that sound like the beginning part of Psalm 40? That God has given us this new psalm, that God has worked in our lives and he lavishes us with these great things. And that can be the song of our own heart. Doesn't mean that life always goes the way that we want. We will have pits. We will have challenges. We will feel stuck and we feel hopeless. But those pits, they are not permanent. God hears our cry. He lifts us up. And he gives us a new song. And so for those of us who are in the pit, may we hear these words and may it give us hope and trust that God will be faithful and he will get us through them. For those of us who aren't in the pit, may we create that database in our mind of all the ways that God has worked. And we remind ourselves that God is at work constantly in our lives so that when we are in the pit, we can remember them. And God can help us to remain faithful. God is the one who lifts us up out of the pit, and he gives us salvation through Jesus. May we never forget that. God will get us through every challenge we face. It may not be the way that we want it to, but he is always at work. He is always at work, and we need to trust his faithfulness. May we declare his faithfulness to one another to help us trust that. And may his Spirit remind us of that truth today, now, and forever. Let's pray.
You have just watched a sermon from Crossway Church in Battleground, Washington. We hope that you enjoyed it, and we'd love to have you come join us for a worship service on Sunday at 10 a.m. at 311 North Parkway Avenue in Battleground, Washington. If you'd like to find more information about us online, you can find it at crosswaychurchwa.com.